Should the U.S. have used an atomic bomb on Japan? That depends on who you ask. China, Vietnam, Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Philippines, and all the other countries that were brutally occupied didn't criticize it. They were finally freed from the genocidal Japanese who killed over 10 million civilians. Hundreds of thousands of women were raped, and children were murdered. Some of the most barbaric atrocities in the history of warfare were committed by men loyal to the emperor. It's also true that after the second bomb was dropped, he ordered his people to surrender. In his speech, he noted that the Americans had a terrible new weapon. It was estimated that the U.S. would have suffered 100,000 casualties if they invaded Japan. But what hasn't been talked about is the tens of thousands who were dying every day around Asia because the Japanese wouldn't surrender. And that doesn't include the hundreds of thousands who were imprisoned. Between 50 to 200,000 women were sex slaves of the Japanese Imperial Army. They were repeatedly raped for months or years. Many were tortured and ill-treated, beaten, stabbed, or burned with cigarettes. Most were less than 20 years old, some as young as 12. They never objected to the nuclear bombs being dropped on Japan. Vietnam suffered from a famine in 1945, caused in part by Japanese stealing their food. The Japanese beheaded Vietnamese who stole bread and corn while they were starving. One study concluded that the Japan-induced famine killed 1 to 2 million Vietnamese by starvation. The survivors did not object to America nuking Japan. The Japanese killed around 20 million Chinese. 8 million were civilians and 12 million military. During the rape of Nanjing, death toll estimates vary from 40 to over 300,000, with rape cases ranging from 20 to over 80,000 cases. This was one of the most barbaric massacres in the history of mankind. During it, 2 Japanese soldiers had a contest vying to be the first to kill 100 people with a sword. It ended up 106 to 105 humans slaughtered, 211 total. Army officers used Chinese prisoners of war for bayonet practice. They gassed and shot them en masse after tying them to posts. They were starved, beaten, and tortured. The Chinese have never criticized Harry Truman for ordering the bombs to be dropped. The Manila Massacre of 1945 killed 100 to 500,000 people. Violent mutilations, rapes, and massacres occurred in schools, hospitals, and convents. There were mass rapes against women and girls, some as young as 12 years old. After years of tyrannical occupation, the Filipinos were not opposed to using nukes on Japan. According to British historian Mark Felton, officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy ordered the deliberately sadistic murders of more than 200,000 Allied seamen and countless civilians in cold-blooded defiance of the Geneva Convention. At least 12,500 British sailors and 7,500 Australians were murdered. The Japanese Navy sank Allied Red Cross vessels, then murdered the survivors floating in the sea or in lifeboats. During naval landing parties, the Japanese Navy rounded up, raped, then massacred civilians. Some of the victims were fed to sharks, others were killed by sledgehammer, bayonet, crucifixion, drowning, hanging, and beheading. The survivors of these massacres never objected to the use of nuclear bombs. The number of people killed by the Imperial Japanese Army germ warfare and human experiments is around 580,000. Special Japanese military units conducted experiments on civilians and POWs in China. And then there's Unit 31. The Japanese conducted some of the most barbaric atrocities in the history of humanity. They would amputate limbs and cut open bodies without anesthesia. If there were any survivors, they certainly did not have any issue with the use of nuclear bombs. Now, you can make a good case that the bomb should have been dropped in Tokyo Bay as a warning, but they only had 2, and what if that wasn't enough to get the emperor to order a halt to the war? What is certain is that Hirohito ordered his people to surrender just after the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, and that ended years of killing, raping, and imprisonment for the people of Asia. And for the most part, Japan never properly compensated or apologized to their victims.